finish what you started, you came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Economowalk is in the house.
Hang on a second. She's getting her chair because she knows how this works. She knows she's got me over a barrel.
Mummy can't put it on.
No, Mummy can't put it on. Only daddies can do it. That's right. You see, I'm brave when I'm home alone. How are you, buddy? Are you well?
I'm good. I'm secretly recording you right now.
Yeah, you can just go ahead. Oh, you are as well. Yeah, I can see. This one.
This is the content that people want to see.
Yes.
How does a member of parliament manage to take care of his children while navigating the great problems of international politics?
That's basically it.
Cartoons.
All right. I'm gonna leave you with that. Okay, Walkertine? Here you go.
Bye,
Right.
Beatrice.
Yeah, she's not listening to either of us right now. This is the what can I say? This is the reality of coronavirus lock-in. I'm trying to hack out something on what we're dealing with China for a paper for this Sunday.
Let's use this to talk through some of the ideas.
Okay.
So, first of all, thank you for taking the time to do this. What time is it over there?
It's now 3:00.
3:00. And where are you in England?
So I am in West Kent. West Kent is the single most beautiful part of the kingdom. And indeed, up until about 800 AD, it was a separate kingdom. It was the Kingdom of Kent. And it is a fantastic part of the country. It was never conquered. So unlike the rest of the country that was conquered by William the Conqueror, William very wisely went round Kent because the Kentish knights were too fearful, too strong. So he went round. So our motto is unconquered, invicta.
I love that. A military tradition and indomitability that no doubt continues to this day, as personified by Tom Tugendhat.
Hey, I'm here. My fellow brother in arms, Mike, it's great to be with you.
Thank you. We have tens upon tens of followers here that are going to be watching at some point. So quickly, maybe tell, for those who don't follow British politics closely in America, who are you, Tom? Hi, Beatrice. How are you?
I'm watching. Can I come back in a minute? No, you need to go and watch. I'm going to come in a minute, okay? Okay, sorry. This is literally how my life works at the moment. My wife is working as well, and so it means that she has managed to wrestle one of the children to the ground, and I'm left with the other one.
Is she in France working, or where is she?
No, she's not. She's downstairs, and she's got him doing his homework. So that's how she got him quiet.
Not only does your wife work in the French government, but you yourself have French heritage as well.
Right.
Am I correct? So explain, give us the hero origin story of Tom Tugendhat.
So I am, well, the name you will probably guess is not English. It's actually Austrian. Tugendhat is an Austrian name. We're Jews from Vienna. My grandfather came over in the 20s and married an English-Irish lady. So our family is from Vienna and from Limerick, and also on my mother's side from just south of Paris. So there you go. So proper old, full-on European heritage.
And where'd you go to school, and at what point did you think about joining the military?
So I did 2 degrees. I did a first degree in theology and a second degree in Islamic theology. And after that, I was a journalist in Beirut for a couple of years, studied Arabic in Yemen, and did many other things. And did that thing where I sort of felt I had to grow up and get a real job. So I went back to the UK, and I became a management consultant, and I was bored. I mean, like really bored. So I joined the Army Reserve. And in 2001, my world changed and everybody else's world changed. And I was mobilized for war in Iraq and went to Iraq in 2003. And in many ways, never looked back. That's when I stayed with the military.
And at what point, so you were an intelligence officer, am I correct?
That's right. I was an intelligence officer with the Royal Marines unit, which was great fun.
How does it work in the in the British military? Do you specialize in a domain of intelligence early on, or are you a generalist from the start doing all forms of int? How does it work?
So the officers are more generalists, the soldiers are more specialists by and large. But because I was an Arabic speaker, having spent all that time in the Middle East, I was sent in really as an interpreter and forward intelligence officer. So I was doing. I mean, you'll remember in Iraq, certainly in 2003, a lot of the intelligence was, how can I put this politely, duff, and so we found ourselves driving around looking for folk to talk to and engaging in conversations to try and work out exactly what was going on.
By the way, of all the places you could have studied Arabic, you chose Yemen. I mean, no offense to our friends in Yemen, but Jordan's a beautiful place. Oman, Morocco. Why Yemen, Tom?
So I went to Yemen because it was the mid-90s, and it was one of those brief moments when Yemen was actually peaceful. So you could go and study in Sana'a. And it so happened that I was right. That was literally one of the few times you could have gone and studied in Sana'a. So I lived in a very peaceful Yemen for 6 months, a country I got to know and love very much, during one of those very brief windows when I could. I literally drove around the country, in the back of taxis, visiting some fantastic people in some amazing places. Something that you couldn't do now. I mean, well, not unless you were completely nuts. And in fact, a fellow alumnus of the school I was at, we all heard about many years later when he made the news, a fellow called John Walker Lind. I don't know if you remember.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so he was a year above me at school.
Did you ever interact with him?
I met him briefly, but
Wow.
I don't think we would have described each other as friends even then.
Known terrorist associate, Tom Tugendhat.
There you go. Well, he wasn't then, of course. He was then a US college student out to study Arabic. I believe he converted to Islam while out there, but I don't think he was a Muslim when I met him.
What was the theory on, I don't even remember why and how he was radicalized? Just by being there and studying Islam?
Look, I don't know. I don't know, but there were a few of the kids who were out there. It was mostly men, funnily enough. A few women went to study in Yemen, but not so many. The women, mostly understandably, went to places like Syria and Egypt where it was easier. So the kids who I was at school with in Yemen, we all lived in these big sort of Yemeni skyscrapers, sort of 5-6 floors up, that you see in Sana'a, and those amazingly beautiful photos. They're sort of mud skyscrapers, incredibly beautiful. And if you lived in a place like that where all you're doing is studying Arabic, going out for tea, quite a lot of people, understandably, developed a very strong interest in local practices, and one or two of them converted to Islam. Now, most of them didn't take the further step of going into radical jihadism, but clearly he did.
So you joined the military, you deploy to Iraq, you deploy to Afghanistan. How many years were you in total? And then take me through the decision about whether to stay in and make a career out of it, get out, and where did politics sort of enter the equation?
So as I say, I got mobilized for the Iraq War. So I was mobilized at the end of 2002 for the war that we knew was coming. Went out in 2003 and stayed in the military then for the war. Went back actually helping on a project to launch the new Iraqi dinar, so to try and stabilize the Iraqi economy, which was a fascinating project, as you can imagine, running convoys delivering money to all the banks in Iraq. I commanded the central region, and we delivered something around $2 billion equivalent out of a total of $4.5 billion equivalent that was delivered inside Iraq in that time. And that was as you can imagine, that was a fascinating logistical exercise and military one. And I then went to work for the Foreign Office and helped out on a couple of projects around the place, and ended up helping to set up the National Security Council of Afghanistan, and then got asked to go and help set up the government, the provincial government in Helmand. And from there, as the advisor of the governor, I got called back into the military and spent the next 2 years on the ground in Helmand, which I know many of your fellow Marines will know extremely well.
Did you work closely with the American Marines there, or how integrated was NATO ISAF or whatever it was called at that time?
So in the very early days, I worked very closely with a particular Marine who was a major in your corps, who had been based down in Lashkargah. He was there was a a reserve unit, a guard unit out in Lashkar, and one Marine with them. And he and I got on very well for rather obvious reasons. And we had a very good time together. I then worked very closely with the 82nd, and for the capture of Musakala in the north. I was serving very closely alongside the 82nd, and had a fantastic experience at the U.S. Army. I have to say, I really enjoyed working with them.
So you could have. Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
I was just gonna say you could have stayed in uniform. Why choose a thankless profession like politics post-military?
Well, you know, and I know that you get to a point, Mike, where if you don't like the orders, you got to go higher up the command chain, right? When I got back from Afghanistan, the new incoming chief of the army staff, a guy who I'd worked with when he was commander of ISAF, was General Sir David Richards, as he was then, and fantastic commander. And he asked me to go and work on the Army Strategy Branch, which I did for a year. And then afterwards, he was promoted to be Chief of the Defence Staff, so Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he asked me to join him as his military assistant, what you'd call the XO. And I had an amazing time working for him. And Mike, we've both worked for pretty strong characters, I think it's fair to say, over our professional careers. And it's very unusual when, after working with somebody as intimately as you do, when you're the XO to a guy and you travel with them half the time and all the rest of it, that you walk away from that relationship thinking more of the person than you did going in. And I have to say, I was incredibly lucky. I left nearly 4 years of service working for now General the Lord Richards, thinking even more highly of him than when I'd gone in. But when he retired in 2013, it was time for me to go. And you know that moment when you get that you've had a great time, the military's been fantastic, but it's time to go. And that was the moment that I got to. And there were things that I didn't like about the way we were doing foreign policy. There were things I didn't like about the way we were deploying our military. And the other thing that people miss, I think, when people think about the military, is they think about the military as an arm of foreign policy, which of course it is. Of course it is. But I would argue that you only really, really get to know your country if you live with people from every part of it. And the reality is, the military is when, you can quite literally, and I do mean literally, find yourself sleeping on the ground next to a prince on one side and a guy who was brought up in care, who never met his parents and was adopted at the age of 2 and then multiple adopted 15 times after that, on the other side. And so I got to see a part of my country that I loved very much, but thought that we could do better for everybody.
That is well said. And I do, speaking of princes, I do want to spend at least a half hour dissecting Prince Harry's defection to Canada or LA or whatever the current is. That's really the content we're here.
That's really where we're going, is it? This is going to be really dull for anybody who's interested in anything else.
So how does a military guy get elected to Parliament, and then how does he become chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee within Parliament?
So luck, if I'm honest, as you and I both know, Mike, frankly, most of our careers is based on extreme good luck and not much else. So I found myself just married, and my wife, as you can understand, and I'm sure your wife's hugely supportive, but my wife wasn't desperate that I went into politics immediately. She was rather keener that I sort of, perhaps had a career and made some money. Public service in the military is great, but it's not exactly where you build up the paychecks to ride you through the rough years, is it? So I was there was a seat coming up, and I wanted to see how the process worked. It was in an area I know very well in Kent, and I'm actually from East Kent rather than West Kent, but it's not very far away.
Who's your football team if you're from East Kent?
We don't do football, we do cricket.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Just for the record, though, I don't support football. I support American football. I don't support.
So I'm a big Steelers fan, but
Oh, Tom. God, this is going so great until this moment. All right, we don't need to get into this. So your wife is reluctant, but you're curious. And
there's things I want to do. There's things I want to do in politics. There's things I want to change, and so I convinced her to let me have a go, right? And she agrees that I can have a go, so long as we'll then get back to the real business of starting a business, getting the family going, and all that. And the problem is I enter the open primary in a very strongly conservative district, knowing absolutely certainly that I won't win, and I ended up winning it. So that's how I got elected. And then after a couple of years of watching foreign policy going, frankly, all over the place in the UK, the opportunity came at the change of the election in the new election in 2017, when people were standing for committee chairs, because our process is slightly different from yours. The chairs are divided by the parties according to proportion within Parliament. So, the Conservatives will get more than half the chairs of the select committees because we got more than half the seats in Parliament. But then once the chair has been allocated as a Conservative chair, any Conservative MP can run for it. Now, it's not usual that you run in your, within 2 years. That, in fact, it's the quickest anybody has run for a chair in the past. And so I was very lucky to win it straight out.
And it gets voted on by your peers within your party, correct?
And so you're not voted on by your party. Any Conservative can stand, but the whole of Parliament votes.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Got it. So that you became chair in 2015.
Yeah.
You just got reelected as chair a few months ago, correct?
That's right.
And how long does your term go as chair, or is it just subject to whenever Parliament reshuffles?
So it's your period of office, your mandate lasts for one parliamentary term. So in theory, 5 years, but actually last time it was only 2.
You guys seem to be having a lot of elections recently.
Yeah, we're going to the congressional system of every 2 years.
You don't want to go to that system. I think when we had a beer in England, the thing that made my jaw drop to the floor was when you described how little money you need to raise to actually run for office in the UK compared with America, where it's just a disgusting sum that is required to run for Congress.
Sure. So shall I tell you?
Please.
How much I spent? So we had a snap election, as you'll remember, in December last year, so about 4 months ago. And do you know how much money I spent on that election?
This is going to depress me, no matter how small the sum is. I have no idea.
It's £13,000.
Oh my gosh!
About $16,000-17,000 total. Not me. I mean, that's the total that was spent. That's all of it.
That is unbelievable. That would be like a week's worth of spending. Not even that in a competitive congressional election. Unbelievable. Okay, so let's get into the issues of the day here. So you are quarantined at home in Kent, correct? And by the way, I assume your daughter is okay in the other room over there.
She's fine. She's fine. She's watching Pets too. And may I say, it is a great movie, just by the way.
Okay, good. So I think a lot of people were looking at the UK strategy, and there seemed to be this shift, right? Originally, there was this kind of hybrid model where the theory was you could develop a herd immunity among the younger population. And then I don't know if it was because of the data coming out of the Imperial College of London study or what convinced Prime Minister Johnson to change course. But I do think there's been a dramatic course change. So just kind of take us through what is the basic approach the government is taking to coronavirus right now.
Sure. So yeah, there has been a switch. I mean, the government obviously denies it, but everybody can see it. So let's be frank. There's been a pretty clear switch, and the switch has come because the data coming out of Italy and that was analysed by Imperial College has made it pretty clear that actually the implications for a herd immunity strategy are pretty severe, as in an awful lot more dead than frankly anybody would like to see, and it would have overwhelmed our National Health Service. Now that not just morally would be very difficult to deal with, but politically would have been suicidal. So quite reasonably, the Prime Minister saw the implications and reset. So I'm
just quick ask on that. Is the issue that, as I understand it, even those who could develop an immunity and are younger and healthier, it's difficult to get them to fully segregate from the more vulnerable population, and so you end up getting the spread to the people that you don't want to have it spread to anyways.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to maintain a sort of a shielded part of the community, you can't do it because you're getting too much natural spread. And that's what we've moved away from. So the reality is that, that's what we're now doing is effectively we're stopping people traveling as much as possible. I mean, we're not quite down in the full Chinese lockdown where people are being welded into their homes, but we are restricting travel as much as possible. So you can go shopping if you need to, but if you go to a shop, there's now queuing outside most shops. So that what they do is they restrict the number of people in a shop to try and maintain a sort of 2 meter distance. And then of course, you've got to maintain personal hygiene levels. So, washing your hands frequently, making sure that, try and touch your face as little as possible, and all that.
And those who don't know you should know just how difficult it is for you to maintain personal hygiene. And I know that's been a struggle. We appreciate your sacrifice, Tom.
This is the Marines having a go at the army again. No, I get it.
So just quickly, is Parliament meeting at all? How is Parliament operating? I mean, how is that working? I mean, we're not in session in Congress. There's this interesting debate about whether and how we could vote remotely if need be. What would the cyber vulnerabilities be of that approach? I'd just be curious if there's a similar debate in Parliament happening.
Right, so you and I are using Zoom right now, which we know is not an encrypted form of technology. We know that this is a potentially public platform. In fact, it will be a public platform. So
apparently, I've been reading all these articles in the last 24 hours that all the engineers for Zoom are in China. So I'm going to have to develop a different platform to do this on. This is like not TikTok, but it's maybe a few degrees removed from TikTok.
So what's quite funny about this is actually there are some countries that already do this pretty well. And one of them is Estonia. Now, Estonia realized a number of years ago that if you live next to a bear, you'd better think of anti-bear methods pretty early on in your planning. And they did. And so if you use some of their products, Skype being one of them, you end up with, apparently, I'm not the expert, but relatively higher levels of encryption than with some of the others. Because the Estonian government knew very well when they had their first online cabinet meeting, I think it was 20 years ago, that the Kremlin would be listening. And so they've spent a lot of money, a lot of time investing in technologies that the Kremlin would find it harder to listen to. I don't know whether the Kremlin can't listen to, but certainly find it harder. And so I think we need to draw a lot of lessons off the Estonians. The Estonians, by the way, have also gone on to a fully electronic system and what they call e-citizenship, which is very interesting, where you can sign documents electronically and vote electronically and do many other things electronically. And so I think they're probably one of the few countries that's very little affected in that sense by this lockdown. But look, we're having the same debates here about voting online, about holding committee sessions online, and how do we do it? And clearly quite a lot of the stuff that we do, the security element is about fraud, but it's not about privacy. What we say in Parliament is public. Parliament is a public session. What we say in committees is public, and how we vote is public. So that's not the security problem. It's not. We're not talking about private telephone calls that could be listened to. The security issue for us, of course, is the legitimacy of the vote, and that's something we've got to maintain. But actually, given that you and I can see each other, if you email me on a separate system and then you tell me face to face what you've done and the two correlate, then it's not that difficult to have security of voting in a public organization like the Congress or Parliament. That's pretty simple. Yeah. But what is much harder is to maintain the security, the stability of the system. And so we must make sure we have a system that is stable enough and that can't just be brought down on the whim of foreign power.
This is a total side note here. I'm curious, just as a chair of a committee in Parliament, how wedded are you to leadership and the Prime Minister and all the other ministers? In other words, are you considered part of leadership? And I bring this up, and that may be a weird question, because in Congress, if you're a committee chair, you're effectively tied to the majority leader and the speaker. Are you able to sort of go rogue and do your own thing? How does that work?
So I'm specifically not tied to the leadership. So my job is to represent Parliament and to represent, so technically and legally, we are a subcommittee of Parliament. So Parliament is the committee and we're one of the subcommittees, right? And we call it a select committee, but it's just another word for it. And so our job is to question and hold the government to account as Parliament should, not as part of the leadership. So, when Foreign Secretary comes before the Foreign Affairs Committee, they don't get an easy ride, right? And that's not the point of it. The point is that they get challenged on their views, they get challenged on their policies, and indeed, some people may think that that's one of the reasons my relationship with the Prime Minister isn't so close, because he was the Foreign Secretary who I was holding to account in the last session of Parliament. So some may think that may have a connection, but I wouldn't know.
Very delicately put. Man, I'm so glad we revolted from you guys, because your system is so opaque to me. It's just, I don't understand any of it. Okay. So one thing we're seeing here is, it's interesting. We have the Imperial College study that's gotten a lot of attention. We have other articles by non-epidemiologists that have gone viral with apocalyptic projections. We've had Stanford professors and other credible voices not denying coronavirus, but saying, hey, these models may be off. And then all of this is filtered through just the black hole that is social media, combined with active Chinese Communist Party propaganda that useful idiots in our media, and perhaps yours too, are parroting. Talk to us a little bit. Are you seeing what is the frustration around the lack of available evidence in the UK, and how is Chinese propaganda playing a role in that disinformation?
Sure. So look, you and I are not pandemic experts, and what we're trying to do as politicians, I think, is to take in as much information as possible, to listen to reasonable people, and to come up with reasonable policy suggestions based on the intelligence and based on the information that we get. I mean, it's not rocket science, and thank God, because we're not rocket scientists, but it's trying to use the judgment of knowing your community, of being a local representative, but also listening to national debate. That's right. That's how representative politics works. And that's what we're trying to do. And what's the problem comes when the data is being corrupted. Now, sometimes it's been corrupted accidentally, in the sense that it's just very hard to get accurate data from some areas. It's very hard to be certain, for example, what the total number of people who've been infected with this virus is, because nobody's testing enough. Nobody at all is testing enough. So we just don't know what the reservoir is of people who've had the infection but actually shown no symptoms, or who've shown very minor symptoms. We just don't have that data. And then there's the active corruption, and some of that we're seeing, as you rightly say, that the Chinese Communist Party's foreign affairs spokesman has been claiming that this somehow is, introduced by the US military, or, any number of these bizarre conspiracy theories. They would be laughable if they weren't so serious, right? And the problem is that being able to make proper policy assessments out of this is really difficult. Now, it's hard enough for you and me when we're reading in English the original documents from sources that we at least have heard of before and therefore recognize. And so, yeah, it's tricky, but you and I know that if it's a Harvard report or an Imperial report, it's probably valid, right? It's got some sort of legitimacy to it. Somebody has hired that guy, somebody has checked the work, somebody has probably, in some way contributed to it, somebody has checked it before it was published. There's a whole series of stuff. Imagine you're from a country that is not used to academic reporting in this way, a state that is not used to freedom of the press, a state that is not used to academic independence in the way that we are. And you get, on one side, a report from, say, Imperial College that makes certain statements, but you've never heard of Imperial College. You don't read the original English. You're reading it in a rather poor translation, and some of the words therefore have been, not deliberately, but just sort of corrupted in the translation. And then on the other side, you've got a piece of Chinese propaganda. The two look much more legitimate to each other. They look much more equal than they do to you or me. And that's where we've got to realize this Chinese communist propaganda is not actually designed to affect you. It's not trying to make you think that the US military was responsible. It wasn't. It's not designed to make me think the US military was responsible. I know it wasn't. It's designed to make countries around the world who have very different systems really question where to turn for the next piece of advice. And this has two effects. The first effect, of course, is an immediate one, which is, if we are going to close down this virus, if we are going to get on top of it, get ahead of it, then what we've got to do is we've got to have a global response. And if there are countries around the world that are not responding in a logical, scientifically based manner, then what they're actually doing is they're creating a further reservoir for us to get reinfected later. Now, we don't know yet, for example, whether secondary infections are a major effect. We just don't know. And that's nobody's fault. That's not, a failure. It's just a scientific lacuna. Now, we'll get there, but we haven't got there yet. So is this creating a secondary reservoir that will then come back and reinfect places that have either successfully fought the virus so far, or maybe about to successfully fight the virus? We don't know. The second effect that it has, of course, is that it's intended to shape the world afterwards. If what you're trying to do is see this coronavirus event as a pivotal moment in modern global history, which I think it will be, and I suspect, the economic implications at the very least will make it a major event, bigger even than the financial crisis of 2007-8. Then what you're trying to do is you're trying to shape the world afterwards, and that's what the Chinese government's trying to do. They're trying to turn countries that have previously, or up to a point, seen the prosperity brought by things like the World Trade Organization, by international free trade, by partnerships with open economies like ours, as in fact a bad thing, and that what they should instead do is kowtow to a form of mercantile colonialism that is beginning to spread out of Beijing.
I've been shocked at how brazen it's been. I mean, it seems the signal has just gone up, and all the United Front entities around the world are responding right now. I mean, from the very obvious of, Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, joins Twitter, and his first tweet is, crates of supplies he's shipping to his friends in America, and Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, welcomes him. To, I think it was yesterday, 2 days ago, there was paid content in Politico from the Huawei's, some Orwellian title. It was their chief representative to EU institutions. And it was just a column saying, we have only altruistic motives here. We're all Europeans today. That was the headline of the article. And so I just be curious, maybe help connect this, what China's doing to, let's say, exploit the coronavirus crisis, to what it's been doing for a long time, and what you have been on the leading edge of warning us about in terms of trying to dominate the future of 5G and just telecommunications more broadly.
So look, I didn't start off as a China hawk, and I certainly still don't consider myself one. I see myself as trying to defend the world in which the values that matter to the people of the United Kingdom, and more particularly to the people of Kent, prosper. And those values are, freedom, democracy, the ability to challenge authority, and the ability to trade and travel globally. I mean, I think those are pretty simple values. Now, I'm not.
And cricket. Don't forget cricket.
And cricket, of course, and cricket. And this is one of the reasons why, America fails so miserably on so many counts. But but it's only a matter of time before we'll get you away from baseball. Don't worry. But I don't think these are particularly contentious ideas. But in trying to defend them, or trying to understand them better as a foreign policy, as an element of our foreign policy, one of the things that we started to do was look at how, this was a couple of years ago, we decided to look at how our relationship with China is going, given that, we've been in a so-called golden era with China, between the UK and China, for the last 5 or so years. How's it going? So we asked, not unreasonably, I think we asked for visas to go and visit China. And the request was very welcomed and accepted, and the Chinese embassy were extremely helpful in getting the committee to visit China. And the visa didn't come, and it took a while, and eventually the visa guy phoned up and said, look, one of your number has been to Taiwan, and you can't have him on the trip. I said, look, I'm really sorry, this is pretty simple. Either the Foreign Affairs Committee travels, or it doesn't travel. Now, you're perfectly entitled to refuse the Foreign Affairs Committee of the UK Parliament, that you're allowed to do, but what you're not allowed to do is to choose who is on the committee and who is not. That's decided by the British Parliament. So do you want us to go or not? And eventually they said, okay. They let us go, including the guy who'd been to Taiwan. And what became quite obvious afterwards, when we wrote up our report, which I have to say I thought was pretty reasonable, which You can read it online on Foreign Affairs Committee website on parliament.uk. It set out some challenges that we have going forward. And some of those challenges are to do with British academic institutions being influenced by Chinese politics. Now, this isn't secret. We know about the Confucius Institutes, and we know about the attempt to influence, universities in California and Australia and Canada. This isn't news. But I got such a, what I would describe as shirty letter back from the ambassador telling me off for my, temerity in calling out China's actions in various areas, that I started to question what more was going on. And that's when we started to look at different areas. And it became pretty obvious to me, and indeed to the whole of the committee, that what we're beginning to see is not a sort of an accidental growth, but actually a policy which is seeing an expansion of Chinese political influence through various deliberate means. And some of them are economic, some of them are political, some of them are academic, some of them, there's a whole series of routes, and some of them linked to the Belt and Road, and some of them linked to Huawei, and some of them linked to ZTE. But there's a whole series of routes where we're seeing a different way of governing the world being imposed. Now, you can quite reasonably make the case that China wasn't a major player in the 50s and 60s and 70s when these rules were being created. And so China does have a legitimate right to say, look, these rules were written before our rise, and therefore we have a right to have a voice in how they're changing. And I accept that. What I don't accept is that that means that we have to bow to China's rules. That I don't accept at all. And that sadly is what we're seeing. And that's why, things like the theft of intellectual property that we've seen undermining so much of the WTO, or indeed, the seasteading that we're seeing undermining the UN law of the sea, all these different policies we're seeing undermining the sort of legitimate organizations. In fact, the disinformation that we're now seeing going through the WHO, undermining these organizations is making it harder and harder and harder for those of us who are trying to maintain the open system of prosperity and free trade that, let's not kid ourselves, has made China rich, seem to find it very difficult to do. And this, this response to the coronavirus, it's not a one-off. This is entirely in keeping with a pattern of disinformation, of seeking tactical opportunity rather than strategic gain, and indeed of utter callousness with the lives of their own people, let alone ours.
So the fault line in this bigger debate about whether China, that you and I have been working on a lot in the last 3 years, has been this question of Huawei, ZTE, and 5G. I think there were a lot of people in America that were taken aback by the recent decision by Prime Minister Johnson to allow Huawei to maintain parts of your peripheral network, compete, I think, for future parts of the network. Maybe we'll just explain it to us,
Sure.
Explain the state of the debate over Huawei in the UK.
Sure. Look, the Huawei debate is not a new one in the UK. We've had Huawei in our systems to a varying degree since 2003. So, at a time when, China joined the WTO in 2001, we thought at the time that, international free trade would encourage people to cooperate more broadly. And we thought that China would be brought more into a sort of an open internationalist system if we traded more freely. And that was the, that was the policy assumption. Well, it turned out not to work. Okay. It was a reasonable policy assumption. It just turned out to be wrong. Okay, fine. But when things turn out to be wrong, you should then change the policy assumption, right? Because you've tested it. We're trying to do the same thing again. And I think that's where the mistake comes in. So look, when Huawei was being looked at as to whether or not it should be part of the 5G market, the National Cybersecurity Centre here, a bunch of our best tech geeks, took a really hard look at the market and evaluated it and described it as a high-risk vendor. Whole series of different reasons that I won't go into, but all online. You can read the report online, and it's a very thorough report, and it does say that the government can mitigate the risk. And I'm not the guy with the noughts and ones running around in my head. And so if the cyber geeks tell me that they can mitigate it, I accept that. But mitigate doesn't mean eliminate. Mitigate means reduce. It does not mean reduce to zero. So the government read that and has decided that they can manage by having Huawei in only 30-odd%, about a third of our 5G network. Now, the problem that I see is that this isn't about having Huawei in a third of our network. It's having Huawei in any of our network that's the problem. Because what we're doing is we are allowing a business that has used anti-competitive practices, effectively what in many other industries would be called dumping, where you sell products below market rate in order to drive out competition. We're seeing that happening in the tech industry. We're seeing holes in Huawei technology that when it was in Italy's Vodafone network, it was reported by Bloomberg as being a backdoor into the network. And we're seeing the way that the company operates, its cooperation, deep cooperation with the Chinese state in places like Tanzania and indeed in South Africa and Pakistan, where we're seeing very strong accusations and indeed quite a lot of evidence that Huawei is part of the Communist Party's intelligence apparatus, effectively. A remote part of it, I accept, but still part of it. And that's a real problem. So I have to say, when the Huawei decision was made, many of us were pretty surprised. I mean, there's not much point in taking back control from Brussels only to hand it over to Beijing. And so we were pretty upset when the government did that. Now, I didn't want to rebel against my government. I mean, like you, I'm a loyal conservative. I think that the Conservative Party is, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think it's the best party to govern the United Kingdom. And I know that you're a loyal Republican as well. And you see that party loyalty matters, and it's not just about my party right or wrong. It's about how do you get things to happen. You need to build a team. You need to work together, and so you don't rebel against that team lightly. You really don't. But for me, this was such an important issue. I couldn't support the government on it. I just couldn't, because this is an issue that we're going to have to live with. In fact, my kids are going to have to live with for the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Are you seeing Huawei, they're doing a version of this here in the United States where they will pay former senators, former members of Congress, former high-level cybersecurity and homeland security officials to, be basically perpetuate their narratives? Are you seeing a version of that in the UK as well?
Yeah, definitely. Their parliamentary spokesperson is a guy I used to know who was an MP up until 2017. You look at their board in the UK and it's the great and the good, you're seeing the same sort of narrative. And the problem is, of course, that on one level, they've got a point. And the point that they've got, which is legitimate, is that there is an element of Huawei, which is another legitimate corporate enterprise, right? I mean, they do actually make networks and they do actually make nodes and they sell them, and that's fine. What's not fine is the fact that this is part of a much larger Chinese strategy to dominate an industry by eliminating competition. And that's not fine. We're seeing that the market has gone from having, 15 or so network providers about 10 years ago to now there's about 5 or 6. Right? That's a real problem. It's a real problem because actually, I'm not a monopolistic conservative. I don't want monopolies, whether it's state monopolies or private sector monopolies. I want to have competition, right? I think that's what makes markets stronger. I think that's what makes industries stronger. I think that's what builds opportunity. And in the UK, that's a really hard market now, because now, for various market reasons, the market has been massively reduced. Now, allowing Huawei to dump technology at below market prices, because it is massively subsidized by Chinese state banks, merely deepens that monopoly. So whether or not you end up buying Huawei doesn't matter. If you're totally dependent on another single firm, you find yourself in a very, very difficult position. And so actually this is for competitive reasons, for geopolitical reasons, frankly, just for reasons of security and personal liberty. This is the wrong answer.
Now, I do think Prime Minister Johnson has a point when he says, okay, when it comes to the non-Huawei alternatives, there's no integrated solution in the same way that Huawei can basically offer 5G in a box, right? You're dealing with one company, not the same thing, and certainly in America, we disinvested in certain hardware components of telecommunication, though we are very good, if not dominant, in certain software components. Do you think there's room for some way in which like-minded free world countries, Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung, all of our people on the software side here could band together to be able to offer an integrated solution or figure out a way that we can get at that fundamental issue whereby Huawei could undercut their competitors by 30% because they're getting funding from the CCP?
Do you see, I don't think we even need to do that. I mean, I think what we need to do is we need to agree that there are certain principles that we are going to say vendors must apply by, right? First of all, you're not allowed to have a security deal with a hostile state, okay? You cannot be dependent on a state that writes a law that says that you have to cooperate with them in intelligence matters if that state is a hostile state. Now that's what Huawei's done, right? That's what Huawei and ZTE have. It's not their fault, I'm not blaming them, but that's what Chinese state law says, right? So if we say that we won't do business with companies that do that. Secondly, we won't allow anybody to have more than a 30% market share of our networks, whether they are Western or anywhere else companies. Then what we'll do is we'll grow competition. And that's actually what we need. Because look, I have no criticism of Nokia or Ericsson or Samsung or Fujitsu or Cisco or any of the others who are playing in this water at the moment. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I think all of us would agree that there is somewhere out there in someone's backyard a company waiting to be started that will also have a share of this. And 5G, 6G, 7G, all of these different systems need to have the ability to grow. Now, they can't grow if all the money is being swallowed up by one single whale. We need to have plenty more fish in the sea, and we can only get that if we refuse to allow the market domination that we're seeing. So simply on a competitive basis, I think that nations like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but actually others like France who've already said no to Huawei, Germany that's in the process of making that decision, countries like that could easily say, look, we're not going to have this. We're going to have a free market. And if we did that, we would not be shaping our own market, or not just shaping our own market, we'd also be shaping the market of countries like India and Brazil, countries that maybe wouldn't have exactly the same rules, but when they saw the different levels of competition, we would spur much greater progress in the industry, and we would allow others, as I say, like India, to piggyback off us when they don't really want to have deals with Chinese tech companies that have deals with the Ministry of State Security either.
So one final serious question before we go into the final fun round of this whole thing. And the translation, for those who are wondering why Tom said ZTE and not ZTE, it's because Britain's a weird place. They also pluralize maths, which I've never understood. It's just math. You don't need the S. So you gave this great speech in which you, I think, colorfully but accurately said, described this as nesting a dragon within the UK's network. What is the state of the opposition right now? But the dragon slayers, if you will, but also there's, this group of Wolverines that's been discussed, people that have kind of opposed the government's decision and are trying to offer a different path. How big is that group? And, what opportunities will you have going forward to, shift course on this?
So look, the opposition that you saw voting against the government in Parliament, when was it? It feels like a year ago, but actually it was only a couple of weeks ago, saw 38 members of the Conservative Party rebel against the Conservative whip. And that's a big number, only 3 months after an election, right? I mean, that's, when the Prime Minister is at his strongest and, people don't like to rebel so soon. So that was a big number, particularly as, bluntly, it wasn't the right bill to rebel on. That was really a symbolic bill. So there was quite a lot of the new members who were thinking about whether or not to rebel, who I encouraged to think hard about it, because it wasn't really the moment. Because the real moment is coming up.
Oh, hi, Beatrice.
Hang on a minute.
We're going to go into the fun round so she can join us for that.
Do you want to come?
Beatrice, can you help us out?
Don't you watch Shaun the
She wants to watch Shaun the Sheep. Can you wait 1 second?
Absolutely.
Excuse me.
That is so cute. Shaun the Sheep is being watched right now. So for those who don't know, the Wolverines is, I don't know how they got this name, whether it was the press in the UK or in the US. It was a name being applied to this group of insurgents. And I don't know if Tom would identify himself as one of this specific group that are opposing Prime Minister Johnson's decision to allow the Chinese Communist Party controlled company Huawei to compete and remain on Britain's network. There is a substantial number of members of parliament that indeed are opposing that decision. And I believe there's going to be a process where they get another chance to review it. And they've proposed maybe taking that 30% down over time to 10 or 0%. But what I'm trying to get at is, what is the state of the opposition? Okay, good. I was running out of things to say there, Tom.
You got to love Netflix.
Good.
Sorry. New form of nannying. Sorry, this is terrible. That was the first stage, if you like. The second stage is coming up in June, July, when there is an actual vote on the government's proposal to put, to allow 30% of the market to be, to allow Huawei to have 30% of the market and to allow Huawei in at all. And at that moment, that's the real vote. And I have to say, I find it very, very difficult to see how if we got 38 rebelling on something that was frankly totemic but not significant, how we don't get more rebelling when it really is significant, and particularly after the pandemic that we're going through, which, has exposed China very, very clearly. I mean, it hasn't, for those of us who've been following China for a number of years, this hasn't taught us anything new, but what it has done is it has advertised it to a global audience in a much broader fashion.
Okay, so in this final fun round, in the minutes we have left, as Shaun the Sheep is playing in the background, we're going to go highbrow and we're going to go lowbrow, Tom. So if we were to go into your library in your home in Kent, give us a flavor for what we might find there. And even if it's not specific titles, just give us kind of, what's your digest of books, of, is it all nonfiction? Is there fiction? Just give us a sense of Tom Tugendhat, the scholar.
So I'm not quite sure anybody's ever called me that before. But so I do read history. I read, funnily enough, I read quite a lot of stuff that's about the sort of lives that we've been through. So I've been reading Emma Sky's The Unraveling, which is fantastic for anybody who hasn't read it. Absolutely amazing book. I've also been reading, in fact, I'm reading at the moment, The Radetzky March, which is a novel about the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the empire that my grandfather fought for when he fought for the Austrian Empire against the Italians in the White War, as it was called, in 1915-16. So I've been reading those. What else? You'd find a lot of P.G. Wodehouse. I don't know if you've read Jeeves and Wooster, but they are incredibly funny, and I strongly recommend them. What else?
Do you read poetry at all? This is a divisive question.
Yeah, I do.
I'm not suggesting I do, but yeah.
You're allowed to. It's okay. So I read a bit of Seamus Heaney occasionally. The Irish ambassador very kindly, actually, for Christmas a number of years ago, gave me a book of Seamus Heaney's verse, and I hadn't read it before, or I hadn't read it since school, I should imagine. And it's really pretty fantastic, actually. I've been trying to learn poetry as well, but because I try to keep my Pashto going by learning Pashto poetry, but I have to say it's so bad. I'm so bad at it that
yeah, my Pashto poetry has really just, it's fallen into disrepair as well. Okay, we're gonna go mid-brow before we go lowbrow here. So I have a theory that the BBC produce exceptional content, whether it's Luther, which is one of my favorite shows of all time, right. Sherlock, which is great as well. The list goes on and on. I have a sort of a half-baked hypothesis that there's an inverse relationship between the decline of empire and the rise of art and humor. And I think that's most prominently expressed in Britain. Why is it that the BBC produce such fantastic shows?
You see, what I love is that you assume that the decline of empire is because, Britain is no longer dominating. you as so many Americans fail to realize that you are the legacy of empire. What we are living through, you see, is very much a British Empire rebranded. Your UK Empire 2.0. You call yourselves Americans, but you're just Englishmen abroad.
Oh, wow. Very, very interesting theory. I do think the sort of British sense of humor is a treasure. It's very unique. It's very dry, and it's something that I admire greatly. What else was I going to say? Okay, we're going to move to lowbrow here. Okay, so when you put down the pastue poetry, when you're not reading obscure histories about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and when Shaun the Sheep is not playing on Netflix and Beatrice is in bed, what sort of guilty pleasures do you have as far as watching is concerned?
Oh God, I love Narcos. I don't know if you watched it on Netflix. Yeah. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, proper. Well, really grim.
Yeah.
Really properly grim. What else? I mean, I love that. There's a whole bunch of shows. I have to say, one of the best things about being in lockdown is, you don't have to feel guilty about doing a box set in an evening, because hey, what are you going to do in the morning anyway?
That's right. Okay, so final question here. Let's say you walk into a bar in Green Bay, Wisconsin, or in East Kent, right? Not West Kent. And
West Kent. I represent West Kent. East Kent.
Oh, West Kent. I'm sorry. You're originally from East Kent. Got it. Yeah. And a young kid comes up to you and says, Tom, I am interested in being a member of parliament one day. I really want to serve my country. What advice do you have for me?
Do anything else first. Do anything else first. Serve your country. Find out who you are. Find out about your community before you decide to represent it. Now, that may not be join the military as we did, but it could be start a business, work in medicine, work in a care home. Do anything else first. Make sure you know the community before you try and represent it, because once you're in post, it's too late to learn. You keep trying to learn, but actually you don't have time. So you're constantly falling back on experiences from before you were elected. I'm sure that you find that the same is true for you. You're constantly, for you, flying between Wisconsin and Washington. You're on the road the whole time. You're calling people the whole time. You're trying to strike, the best deal you can for the folk you represent the whole time. You just don't have time to do the soft learning that you do before you get elected. So if you're thinking about representing your community, make sure you know it.
That is exceptional advice. There's a Kissinger quote to the effect of, and I'm going to murder it now, people don't gain in knowledge or intellectual capital while in office. They consume what they've previously built up. And what you said reminded me of that. I
didn't know that. There you go.
I'll send it to you afterwards. I probably got maybe 5% of that right. Tom, thank you for your friendship. Thank you for the time here. I'm going to go out and say, I'm placing a bet in Vegas on you being prime minister one day. And I'm proud to say that I will have known you when, and please
put it on red. You're more likely to win.
Now Beatrice is going to be famous in the United States. So thank her as well for participating in this great conversation.
Well, she's a star. And Mike, thank you very much for your friendship. And thank you as well for leading the fight as well in so many important areas in the Congress, because how we shape this next generation, this for Beatrice and other kids, is going to be down to how we work together across the Atlantic, as we have done in the past. So it's up to us to decide what matters to us and to fight for it.
Well said. Thank you, my friend.